Hi guys, this is Dr. Marva. Good to see you guys back. I shall be today talking about questions of general medicine from the recently concluded INICT November 2020. Well, if you're still listening to this discussion, it means that you are definitely in the race for NEET PG Entrance Exam 2021, which I know is going to be the best year of your life. I know a lot of you are distressed by the fact that the finish line has been pushed back. I personally feel that could be a blessing in disguise. How? This pushed back exam date is going to give you time to recuperate. It will give you time to catch your breath, re strategize, focus on your weaknesses, and play the catch up game. You see, even if you're a late starter, I'm very, very sure that you can definitely catch up with others. If you're an early starter and are feeling disadvantaged by the fact that others will catch up, no, I'm not saying that others will catch up with you. You already have a head start. You are definitely gonna make it happen. So, as they say, bring it on. Let's get started with the very first question for today. In this question, he's talking about this 55-year-old guy who's coming to you with palpitations for 2 hours with dizziness. Well, when you read this line, you know that what is occurring in the patient is possibly a tachyarrhythmia, which is causing crashing of blood pressure. Why does tachyarrhythmia, why does a fast beating heart cause crashing of blood pressure? The heart is beating so fast that it is not having time to relax. So therefore less would come in, less would go out, and therefore the blood pressure of this guy is literally crashing. You see, blood pressure of 70 is gonna be much lower than the threshold of cerebral autoregulation. You see, the brain blood supply is definitely gonna be reduced in this case. So my message on reading this question is that possibly a tachyarrhythmia is causing a crashing patient. In these circumstances, a urgent ECG will either reveal a narrow complex or a broad complex tachycardia. If it's gonna be a narrow complex tachycardia, we're thinking in terms of possibly a PSVT. Lots of time would be written as AV nodal reentrant tachycardia, or he can be having a possibility of atrial fibrillation since it's relatively a patient in his late 50s, or it could be atrial flutter, or it could be multifocal atrial tachycardia. But the point that I want to make is that in the common tachyarrhythmias that we encounter, which are narrow complex tachycardias, if the BP is crashing, as I've highlighted in the app multiple times, we need to go in for a DC shock. This would be a synchronized DC shock where the computer will fire the impulse at the peak of the R wave. The correct answer to this question is a straightforward option number delta. I'm ruling out option number A, adenosine, because that would be given for a hemodynamically stable patient. If this question is asked again in the exam and the systolic blood pressure of the patient is given to be more than 90, that is where we go in for carotid sinus massage or vagal maneuvers like a face ice pack. That is subsequently the role of adenosine comes in. So I'm not gonna waste my time by giving adenosine in a crashing patient. Well, what is the role of verapamil? Why am I ruling it out? Because verapamil is useful for prevention. As you can see in the snapshot that I posted from the app, we use calcium channel blocker like verapamil to prevent a PSVT. Whereas IV fluids are anyway a disaster in any tachyarrhythmia because anyway they would be pulmonary edema component. So if you give fluids, the pulmonary edema component will rather worsen. The correct answer to this question is option number A, and I think this question has been asked a lot of time earlier in various AIMS exams, JIPMER exam, and I've discussed that in the app as well. So I think most guys got this correct. Let's move on to the second one now. This talked about a 40-year-old person with vomiting episodes followed by severe abdominal pain, hematochezia, prostration. The blood pressure was crashing. The blood pressure of this guy is 90 by 50, so definitely going towards the lower side. The pulse rate is disproportionately fast with the irregularly irregular rhythm. As I've highlighted in the app, I'm showing the snapshot also. Irregularly irregular rhythm has been discussed with respect to atrial fibrillation, and the problem with atrial fibrillation is that they could be clots. These clots that will develop in the left atrial appendage can land up anywhere in the systemic circulation. If they go into the carotid artery, they land up in the brain. The person could end up with possibility of stroke. If the same clots land up in the coronary circulation, the coronary artery thrombus can even trigger a MI. So atrial fibrillation, the clots are the troublemaker. In this particular case, however, he has given a very characteristic manifestation that this particular person is having absent vowel sound. So probably the clots went into the mesenteric artery, they went into the descending aorta, they went into the mesenteric artery, contributing to a possible gangrene in the bowel. I'm ruling out pancreatitis in this case because that traditionally is associated with epigastric pain, whereas in this MCQ, epigastric pain per se was not given. And anyway, irregularly irregular rhythm is the key word in this question that rules out the possibility of pancreatitis per se. Though I'm focusing on the diagnosis of this patient as acute mesenteric ischemia, I found a lot of guys casually answered this MCQ as abdominal aorta aneurysm rupture. Option number C, how is it ruled out, is because I agree to the fact that if this was not a irregularly irregular rhythm, I would have thought of as C as an answer. If I remove irregularly irregular rhythm from the scenario, definitely abdominal aorta aneurysm can be a possibility, but then the catchword in the MCQ has to be picked up. And anyway, there's no history of any peptic ulcer disease. As I highlighted, I mean, peptic ulcer disease perforation will contribute to hypotension. It will definitely contribute to bowel sounds being absent as well, and can occur even in a person with pre-existing coronary artery disease. But the bottom line in this question is, one, you can highlight, since this person is having coronary artery disease, people with pre-existing heart disease are anyway predisposed to tachyarrhythmias. The tachyarrhythmia that can cause sudden death can either be ventricular fibrillation or atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation is a sustained one. Because atrial fibrillation can persist for long duration, that is why there's tendency to form clots. Mark my words there, guys. We don't get clot formation with any other tachyarrhythmias. Only with atrial fibrillation flutter is where you read about clot formation in the atrial chambers, and then it can go into the systemic circulation, contributing to these manifestations. The answer to this particular question is option number beta. The same question can be asked again for scenario given as a post-MI patient. You see, in post-MI also, in fact, I can just quickly jot it down. You're aware that one of the complications of myocardial infarction can be NV aneurysm. Now, if a person will develop left ventricular aneurysm, the damaged part of the heart can again contribute to formation of a clot or a thrombus inside the chamber, and the fragments of this can definitely be disseminated every time the heart will contract. So mural thrombus formation post-MI can again contribute to similar kind of a profile of acute mesenteric ischemia. So there are two scenarios where you read about acute mesenteric ischemia, especially from medicine domain. That's going to be either a post-MI patient or a person having pre-existing heart disease, because I've already explained to you, atrial fibrillation is one of the commonest sustained arrhythmias. Commonest arrhythmia overall in hypertension patients, pre-existing coronary artery disease happens to be atrial fibrillation. That's the sustained one. The answer to this question is option number B. The next question is regarding a basketball player with history of syncope and similar history in the past. On examination, the blood pressure was low. ECG shows deep Q waves on V5 and V6. We read about deep Q waves in MI and second in HOCM. Let's read the question further. He's talking about findings of T wave inversion. So there's definitely some ischemia happening in the heart, because you see there are two evidences of ischemia occurring. One is going to be T wave inversion, second is Q waves, and he's also having history of syncope. Now the key word in this question was this echocardiography finding, that is SAM. I have highlighted SAM means systolic anterior movement of the mitral valve. In a few seconds from now, I'll show a diagram to explain that also, but I just want to highlight SAM, systolic anterior movement of the mitral valve, is a keyword that will help you in diagnosis that this person could be having hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. Some people also mentioned that ECG findings of hypertrophy were also given in the form of, I'll just write down the data, that is, if you're having the depth of the S wave in lead number V1 and the height of the R wave in V5, V6, if it's more than 35 millimeter, it again helps you in identifying left ventricular hypertrophy. Even if the ECG evidence of hypertrophy is not present, one, you have already aware of the fact that if it's gonna be talking about a football player, basketball player, not a professional player, a routine guy knocking the ball around with his friends, just plays with his friends, not a professional player I'm talking about, knocking the ball around with his friends and he's collapsing suddenly, we have to think in terms of hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. Now, the highlight of this medical condition is that because there's a hypertrophy in the heart, so the first thing that happens is that the rate or rise of pulse is very fast. In fact, you can look at this image. I've highlighted that in this chart, because there's a hypertrophy, so therefore there will be a fast rising pulse. Then there is a dynamic left ventricular tract obstruction. Now you can understand dynamic left ventricular outflow tract obstruction as like this, that you're driving a car, you're pressing on the accelerator and the brakes together. If you press on the accelerator and the brakes together, you are doing both acceleration and deceleration. Now the deceleration part is responsible for this dip. So as the blood is going out of the heart, because this particular person will be having this very peculiar septal hypertrophy. This septal hypertrophy acts like an impediment. So it's like a car going over a speed breaker, deceleration, or I said you are driving a car, you are pressing on the accelerator and the brakes together. So the deceleration part is coming in, but the momentum of the car is such, that forward movement will still occur. So there is a second peak in the pulse also, such a kind of a pulse, which is a twice beating pulse. You see, the rate or rise of pulse is due to hypertrophy. Then there was a development of a dynamic left ventricular outflow tract obstruction, which is limiting the exit of blood. So that is why there's a slight dip. And subsequently, the momentum of the car will still allow a forward motion. So you actually get two peaks in this pulse during the phase of systole. And the technical name for this is, as I've highlighted, pulsus bisvariance. So if I go back to the slide, you can notice the fact that I can very easily rule out pulsus alternans because that's going to be encountered with heart failure. Waterhammer pulse is what we see with usually aortic regurgitation. So for pulse, it's obviously pulsus bisvariance. Coming to the murmur part, I want you to understand that these patients will obviously be having an ejection systolic murmur, but the murmur will behave opposite of normal. The standard statement that I've highlighted time and again is that all murmurs will decrease on standing. Why all murmurs will decrease on standing is primarily because of the fact that venous return to the heart will be lesser. If less blood will come in the heart, the intensity of the murmur will reduce. The exception is HOCM and mitral valve prolapse. In HOCM, the murmur will always behave ulta of what normal physiology does. In normal physiology, murmur always decreases on standing in all conditions. The exception is HOCM. HOCM will always behave opposite of normal. So in HOCM, what will happen is murmur will increase on standing. Though the detailed discussion of how is it happening are given in the main section in the app. At the moment, I just want you to remember my statement. All murmurs will decrease on Valsalva standing amyl nitrate because the venous return to the heart is lesser. But in HOCM, it is ulta. The murmur will become relatively louder. And one more information for the subsequent exam. In mitral valve prolapse, the murmur will become relatively longer. In fact, in the murmur section, I've given a detailed explanation of the same, including this has been asked per se even in NEET 2020. So I just want you to go through the previous year paper and you will notice that I have highlighted this fact that the murmur of HOCM is behaving opposite to normal. Well, in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the heart is demanding more oxygen. So to control the demand of oxygen, I need to give beta blockers to this patient. So yes, beta blockers are used for symptomatic relief. All routine cardiology drugs like digoxin, ACE inhibitor, nitroglycerin, calcium channel blockers, they're absolutely contraindicated, but propranolol is always used. And then we are going to put a device in the chest of this guy. This device is going to read ECG, analyze ECG, and deliver a DC shock without the patient being even aware of this. We call it implantable cardioverter defibrillator. When should you put it? When there is history of either sudden death, like in this case, you are anyway aware HOCM has a genetic basis. So this guy says that my elder brother died suddenly. Then in those circumstances, you definitely need to, because his elder brother died suddenly. This guy is lucky. He came to you. Otherwise, he could have also died. So we should put in a ICD. Similarly, if there is a documented history of syncope in a person and not one, multiple episodes, we should put an implantable cardioverter defibrillator. I mean, every time he's not going to be lucky enough to reach the hospital. And if, look at the next statement, I mean, very characteristic. LV wall is more than 30 millimeter. Imagine left ventricle wall is 3 centimeter thick. I mean, to provide so much of oxygen is always going to be a challenge, and therefore these patients usually have episodes of chest pain, especially on climbing stairs or any kind of physical activity. You see, I want to highlight the fact that this guy is not a professional football player. I mean, the amount of physical stamina required for a professional football player is much, much more than what a HOCM patient can handle. So don't be under impression that we're talking about professional football or professional games here. This guy is just knocking the ball around with his friends and he collapsed. And that is when the workup of this patient was identified. So I have put the correct data as pulsus bisvariance. There's definitely a ESM due to obstruction in the heart. It's an outlet obstruction. It's a dynamic outflow obstruction. The murmur will behave opposite or normal. So that is why it is increases on standing. We use beta blockers. We definitely use ICD for these patients. In fact, the treatment of choice for these patients is implantable cardioverter defibrillator. Coming to the next question, he's talking about a middle-aged person presenting to you with complaints of fever for 4 days and a rash on anterior chest wall for the same duration with neck signs. Whenever you read fever and rash together, you are always thinking in terms of a viral exanthematous illness. The bad news is there is neck signs present in this guy. It could be Brudzinski sign, it could be Kernig sign, it could be nuchal rigidity. There's no history of foreign travel or no tick bite, so he's trying to rule out possibility of Lyme's disease in this case. And he's also trying to rule out some imported foreign infections coming into the patient. Lumbar puncture was done, CSF report is attached. So let us now see what the CSF report says. The gross appearance is clear. If it's a bacterial meningitis, we expect it to be turbid. The cells are nucleated. I have already highlighted to you that whenever we are talking about CSF lymphocytosis, that's going to be cells of, let me say, 100 or 100 to 1000 or even higher than that. Lymphocytosis is always two possibilities. Either it could be tubercular or it could be viral etiology, and a history of 4 days can never be tubercular etiology. If this is going to be a scenario of a child who has never received BCG and the illness is for weeks altogether, it's tubercular meningitis. But whenever it's going to be CSF lymphocytosis present in a person with a short duration of history, it's a viral etiology. But let's read on. Sugar will do the discrimination here because CSF sugar is usually towards normal side in viral etiology, but is always low, significantly low in a person who is having a bacterial etiology. Well, I have highlighted this fact that when CSF sugar is less, we call it hypoglycorrhea. CSF sugar, how much is normal? That is two-thirds of the blood sugar. So if I just put a bit of mathematics here, then the blood sugar of this guy at the time of sampling was about 80. So two-thirds of 80 would be something in the range of, I would say, 160 divided by 3. So mathematics or doctors is bad, so I'm just putting up the values here. That's going to be something like 50 milligram percent or approximately. So if the CSF of the sugar of this person was less than 50, I could have thought in terms of a tubercular etiology. But since in this question the value is given to be rather higher than the mathematical value that we have tried to identify, so I would give benefit of doubt to viral etiology. RBCs are not seen, gram stains, no organisms are detected. So let's look at the options. The first one says NAT, that is nucleic acid amplification technology / PCR for West Nile virus in the blood. Please remember the fact that West Nile virus is not reported in India. So that is why he is talking about absence of foreign travel history. So I'm ruling out option number A. Viral meningitis, the number one cause is enterovirus. We have studied this multiple times. Leading cause of viral meningitis is gonna be enterovirus. Viral encephalitis is Japanese bee encephalitis in India, or it could be herpes simplex 1. But viral meningitis is enterovirus. So this looks to be the answer. C says acid fast bacteria for Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Why am I ruling out tuberculosis in this case? My first point is, or the point I can debate is, there's a short history given in the question. The second feature that is present is that the CSF sugar is relatively towards the normal side in this case, whereas it should be dramatically low in tubercular and bacterial etiology. By latest agglutination test, he's basically trying to evaluate for possibility of partially treated, because lots of time, meningitis patients, when they come to you, especially bacterial meningitis, they might have taken antibiotics from outside, and some of the antibiotics can have a CSF penetration. So lots of time in your emergency or casualty, you might have been admitting patients of partially treated meningitis, and in these patients the CSF picture will change because of antibiotics, and possibly the CSF culture will be sterile. That is where latest agglutination test is useful. So latest agglutination per se is useful for identification of partially treated meningitis. But in this particular case, though no organisms have been detected, a point against, again, bacterial etiology is CSF sugar towards the normal side. And then in partially treated meningitis, which can be a differential diagnosis in this case, I also want to highlight that usually the neutrophil counts remain elevated for the first week of the illness at least. But in this case, you will notice that the neutrophil count is on the lower side and it is lymphocytosis that is predominantly present. So this question is simply talking about the standard important cause of viral meningitis, that's going to be enteroviruses. They are the leading reasons, and that is why the answer to this question is option number beta. Moving to the next one. A middle-aged patient presents with chest pain for last 3 hours. The TROP-I values are grossly elevated. I'll talk about normal values also, but let's read the question further. ECG of the patient shows ST depression with T-wave inversion. So this is going to be a presentation of non-ST elevation MI. Well, whenever you have a non-ST elevation MI, I've taught you a mnemonic that we use for treatment of non-ST elevation MI, and the mnemonic is called as ABE-MON. In ABE-MON, alphabet A would stand for abciximab, B would stand for beta blocker, then is enoxaparin, that's low molecular weight heparin. Then is morphine, oxygen, aspirin, nitrates. That is anyway the standard one. I want you to remember the fact that when it comes to non-ST elevation MI in a person, we do not do thrombolysis. If you do thrombolysis in non-ST elevation MI, the clot, when it is thrombolized, it's actually a platelet-rich clot. So the thrombi are actually thrown into the distal circulation, which can cause worsening of this particular patient also. So we do not go in for a thrombolysis. We rather use drugs. And from the options, if we look at it, I'm ruling out option number A because that's used for ST elevation MI. So A is off the radar. Monitoring and observation. Well, that looks funny. That's a dummy choice. I mean, for somebody who's having an illness as great as MI, monitoring does not make sense. Urgent thrombolysis is anyway contraindicated, so you're narrowing down to the diagnosis. You would be giving aspirin to this patient because you want to prevent further clot propagation, and low molecular weight heparin is anyway recommended. You can just use this mnemonic AB immune, and if AB immune will fail, how do I know AB immune will fail? You see, if the oxygen saturation is not coming up, or the blood pressure is still in the falling mode, or for that matter of fact the crepitations in the chest have become louder and louder. So if on admission versus subsequently, in spite of AB immune, the person is not responding, what do you go in for? Then you go in for a delayed percutaneous coronary intervention. So the treatment part of ST elevation versus non-ST elevation MI is what he basically wanted to see. Are you familiar with the current diagnosis of this patient as is picked up from the ECG finding is that of ST elevation, which is not present. You see, it's saying ST segment depression. For the TROP-T values which are grossly elevated, I want to tell that doubling or tripling of values of TROP-I can definitely help you in identification of MI. The troponin T values are usually less than 0.1 nanograms. For troponin I, there are various kits. It is a range of 0.03 to 0.04 nanogram per ml. And if these values will double and triple, it indicates a myocardial infarction. Please remember the fact that the best test for diagnosis of myocardial infarction is always troponin. For heart failure, we have BNP available, and that was a different question, so I'll come to that subsequently. Coming to the next question, he talks about a doctor going for a morning walk and finds a person unconscious in the park. He says, what is correct with the sequence of CPR? You see, when you find a person who's non-responsive, you need to first check for scene safety because he should be on a straight surface so that at least you can give CPR. If this person is lying near some source of electricity, you need to ensure that he does not get electrocuted. So first thing is checking the scene safety, and then subsequently you would call for help. Well, call for help does not mean that you will scream your lungs out. It just means that if somebody has already had done a basic life support course, that person can help you. Help you with what? That person can help you in procuring a AED, that is an automated external defibrillator, so that you can put the pedals on the chest, and if it's a shockable rhythm, the computer will deliver a DC shock. So call for help just means that two hands are better than one. And I have given in the app a similar scenario of you being at the airport boarding gate and an elderly gentleman collapses in front of you. What are you going to do? So we've discussed these steps, and it would be obviously, verify scene safety, call for help in a person, and then you would subsequently initiate or activate the emergency response, check carotid pulse and the breathing efforts, and if both of them are absent, you would initiate CPR in this person. So I think this was relatively a easier one. Once again, the correct answer for this question would be option number A. That's call for help, check carotid pulse and breathing, and then obviously if both are absent, you start cardiopulmonary resuscitation in ratio of 30:2. I've also posted a separate video on the advances that are currently given in the AHA 2020 report. You see, every 5 years, these guidelines come every 5 years, 2010, 2015, now 2020. So till 2025, you are safe. So you need to basically just listen to one of my videos, which is currently on the YouTube and will be incorporated in the app also. That's going to be the updates on the American Heart Association guidelines for resuscitation. There are only minor differences, but then it's worth a listening. The correct answer to this question is option number A. Coming to the next question, he's asked regarding when would you admit a COVID-19 patient aged 75 years of age to a dedicated COVID health center. Well, let's look at the guidelines for Government of India. That will make it relatively easier for you. You see, if a person is tested positive by RT-PCR, in those circumstances, there can be three scenarios. Either the guy is asymptomatic, or he could be a moderate case, or he could be a severe case. So let us understand what he means by the moderate case. Moderate case would mean that there is definitely a pneumonia, but how do you evaluate this person from clinical domain? The respiratory rate of this patient is something in the range of 15 to 30. SpO2 is in the range of 90 to 94%. So you need to send this guy into a dedicated COVID health center where a good monitoring of this person will be done. On the other hand, if it's going to be a person with respiratory rate of more than 70 and SpO2 less than 90, it's a severe case, then he will straight away go to a dedicated COVID hospital. So how do you decide whether a person goes to a dedicated COVID health center or a person goes to a dedicated COVID hospital is simply based on two parameters, that is the SpO2 of the patient and the respiratory rate. And they simplified this so that even you can use help of paramedical workers, you can take help of even ASHA workers to ensure a proper caseload on each of these health domains that have been set up by the Government of India. On basis of this information, when you come back to this question, you can see that option number A was a dummy choice, presence of chest discomfort. You see the admission criteria is mainly based on the SpO2 value. It is between 90 to 94, so this guy is definitely fitting into a moderate scenario. Respiratory rate of 25, I told you, moderate is going to be a patient who's going to be having a respiratory rate between 15 to 30. Anything more than 30, it's a severe case, and the admission would be to a dedicated COVID hospital, whereas the question is talking about a COVID health center. So B and C are the scenarios where I will be getting this person admitted. D says presence of serious comorbidities. Yes, that looks like that even D should be incorporated, but as I highlighted, you see who decides whether a serious comorbidity. When you say the word comorbidity is understandable. Diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease. Is it serious enough? That is something that is to be decided by a doctor and not by healthcare worker. And the caseload in the community is so high as of now that the government of India has tried to just simplify the algorithm of who goes where. So the basic message is that when you look at this algorithm, he has talked about moderate and severe case on basis of two parameters, that is respiratory rate and SpO2 values. If you can just remember the middle of this table, I think you are bang on spot to crack this particular question. The correct answer to this question will be option number 2. Coming to the next one, he talks about a 65-year-old man with palpitations or sudden onset crushing pain. He says, what is the best cardiac marker for this guy with the highest sensitivity and specificity? You are aware of the fact that CPK-MB takes a longer time to rise. CPK-MB rises by 4 to 6 hours, whereas if I want to identify the disease relatively earlier, I need to go in for troponins. I can do a serial troponin I or a serial troponin T in the patient. The correct answer to this multiple choice question is straightforward, option number beta. C, anyway, you are familiar about the fact LDH begins with L, so it is the last one to rise. And when it comes to BNP, that is B-type natriuretic peptide, that would be useful to identify a case of congestive heart failure. Whereas in this question, is talking about acute coronary syndrome presentation. So to determine the necrosis in the heart, the best way would be cardiac troponins. Coming to the next question, is asking you for sequential arrangement of events in a cardiac cycle. Option A is A wave in the JVP, that's going to be atrial systole. And the moment the atrial systole will occur, then the mitral and tricuspid valve will close, that is the S1. So A is definitely going to be followed by B. Now we're going to select between C and D. Which comes first? A lot of guys casually answered ABCD as an answer, but I just want you to have a look at this diagram. In the main app section in the heart sounds component, I have hand drawn these diagrams by myself. I have tried to correlate heart sounds with JVP and ECG in a single diagram, and we tend to call this as Wiener diagram. This diagram is given in Genong, in Guyton, in all medicine books, in all cardiology books. We read it from first year, but still I found a couple of chaps casually messing up on this MCQ. You see, V wave in the JVP is related to isovolumetric relaxation. Now, if you just see, the T wave is actually starting before the isovolumetric relaxation phase. So, if I just put arrows here, I can highlight the fact that it's gonna be A wave, then it's gonna be the first heart sound, then it's gonna be the T wave, and then it's gonna be the V that is related to isovolumetric relaxation. You can see the sequential arrangement in this case. I would personally suggest you to hand draw the three things together in a single diagram so that you can have a mental orientation, and that is discussed in the main section in the app. When you go to heart sounds part 3, that's where this particular diagram has been highlighted. The correct answer to this question would be option number A, B, D and C. Coming to the next question, he talks about what is correct about a high quality cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Well, the guidelines are push hard and push fast. A doctor is supposed to give approximately minimum 2 chest compressions every 1 second. So mathematically 60 into 2 would turn out to be 120. So that is what he means by the word push fast. At the same time, push hard would imply that the chest should go down by at least 5 to 6 centimeters. That would be at least in excess of 2 inches. Allow chest recoil. Well, why recoil is important is because this will allow filling of blood in the heart. You see, when you are squeezing the heart by giving CPR, it also has to get intermittently filled by blood also. So filling of heart is important. That is why the adequate chest recoil is important. But when you look at D, ventilate at 20 to 25 breaths per minute, well, that is what you do for pediatric basic life support. I'll mention or show you a snapshot of the update also. But the correct answer to this question is option number A. It is A, B, and C. It is push fast, push hard, at the same time allow adequate relaxation. But the breaths that would be usually given would be in a range of 10 to 15 or 10 to 16 approximately. I have highlighted this in my update section, which is on YouTube and will be posted in the app as well. Please remember, it is in pediatric basic life support that it is reasonable to give one breath every 2 to 3 seconds. That is going to be 20 to 30 breaths per minute. So this data is valid for pediatric basic life support, whereas the question per se is for adults. You see, because the remaining options are from adults only. In pediatric life support, the sternal depression is relatively lesser, no? Like for a child, it would be approximately 2 centimeter, not 5 centimeter. So the correct answer to this question is option number A, B, and C. Coming to the next question is talking about a young adult patient with a road traffic accident, and the GCS of the person is 2 plus 2 plus 3. That would be a total of 7. So that definitely tells you that the patient is comatose. Morphine was given in this chap to reduce the pain component, and following that, the respiratory rate of this person dipped and became erratic. The CT of this patient is showing increased intracranial pressure, which is correct about the sudden change in the vitals of this person. You have to realize the fact that is also giving you findings of brain herniation. Well, how do I know it is brain herniation? Because the breathing of this person is erratic. You're aware of the fact that when brain herniation occurs, initially the type of breathing that occurs is called as Cheyne-Stokes, and then subsequently there is a development of a irregularly irregular breathing. Irregularly irregular pulse, atrial fibrillation, and multifocal atrial tachycardia. Irregularly irregular breathing is called as Byard's breathing. That's a feature that you always encounter in patients having an impending brain herniation, which will ultimately cause death. The question says what is correct about this. If this was a single best response, the option A says morphine results in decreased respiration. Obviously, if you give too much of morphine, respiratory depression sets in, causes carbon dioxide retention, carbon dioxide narcosis. So that A option definitely looks okay or a true statement. B says severe head injury causing impending brain herniation. Yes, it is a correct statement. If I have to select between A and B, I'll go with A. C says morphine increases intracranial tension. No, morphine is used to actually manage patients or raise ICP. If you listen to the sedation part during raise ICP lecture, I have spoken regarding morphine being used. Yes, too much of morphine will cause respiratory depression, but it can definitely be used to calm down the patient, sedate the patient. Patient was having morphine addiction. Now that is something where he's trying to say that already morphine addiction was there and you've given more morphine, so that is why the respiratory drive of the person reduced, but that's unlikely to be present per se, given the scenario that there's no history of drug addiction given in this question. So I would like to go with option number A and B as the correct statements, and if I have to select between only one, then option number A would be the most appropriate one for this question. Coming to the next question, it says which of the following is not useful in management of a severe COVID infection? Well, there are a lot of reports regarding remdesivir not being effective. I want to tell you that remdesivir is useful in the initial part of the illness when there's a viral replication. Once the person goes into cytokine storm, there is no role of remdesivir. So if you're going to give remdesivir after, let me say, day 12, day 14, day 15, as is being given lots of time in private hospitals and even abroad, it will not have any advantage. Remdesivir is initial phase of the illness when the virus is replicating. Before the cytokine storm hits the person, remdesivir will definitely help an individual, but it's all about timing for management of this condition. But I just want to highlight that in severe COVID, I'll just show you a snapshot of Government of India guidelines also. Remdesivir is given in under investigational therapy. Steroids are the major mortality reducing drugs in COVID-19. Dexamethasone and methylprednisolone both can be used. There is no efficacy of one over the other. In AIMS website, they have mentioned dexamethasone because of the cost effectiveness as compared to methylprednisolone, which is horribly expensive. I also want to tell you that when you look at an X-ray of a person with severe COVID-19, it's gonna be all white. That all whiteness in the X-ray is not only because of the pneumonia component, but actually COVID-19 also contributes to formation of multiple zillions and millions of microthrombi in the lungs. These microthrombi in the lungs will contribute to ventilation perfusion imbalance. That is why you are seeing that you have put a person on maybe a high flow nasal cannula, then maybe put them on BiPAP, and still the oxygen saturation is continuously falling. In spite of the fact that you're giving oxygen, the saturation is falling. Why? The VP imbalance is explained by the microthrombi. Therefore, we need to give low molecular heparin to these patients. Well, according to the AIMS website, they have categorically mentioned there is no rule of giving any anticoagulant after discharge. You see, a lot of physicians are giving rivaroxaban, apixaban post-discharge to patients also. it's a different thing. Somebody is having a prosthetic heart valve, it's a separate issue. Somebody already had a history of stroke, it is a separate issue that you would like to continue with oral anticoagulants. But otherwise, for routine cases, there is no justified rule for giving anticoagulation post discharge. But during the phase of admission in the hospital, when is a severe COVID case, the advantage of low molecular weight heparin would be to reduce the formation of these microthrombi in the lung and thereby reduce the deterioration of this person or chances of deterioration of this person. Favipiravir, a lot of people are calling it a scam. I would not like to call it a scam because I'm a medical person. I would just like to say that yes, it might be useful for mild COVID. It will be useful to reduce the viral replication in the initial part of the illness. So somebody is having comorbidity. Somebody's had undergone a coronary artery bypass grafting. He's also a patient diabetes mellitus with HbA1c of 11%, 12%. That is the person where I'll be comfortable giving favipiravir in the initial part of the illness. I said severe comorbidity, symptoms occurring in a person, I'm not going to wait for the deterioration component. But once I have documented that he's having severe COVID, per se, favipiravir will not be having any role. The answer to this question, where he mentioned which of the following is not useful for management of this person, the word was not, then the answer would be option number D. Coming to the next question, as I highlighted, the drug that has mainly reduced mortality in severe COVID-19 as of now happens to be steroids. The Government of India guidelines, when you look at that, you will mainly notice that if a person is admitted in a dedicated COVID hospital, two things which are always going to be given to this person is one, dexamethasone methylprednisolone, and then is low molecular weight heparin along with the lung ventilation strategy. For the lung ventilation strategy, it is prone positioning that is recommended. Now, prone positioning and intubating a person is a big problem. So I am not talking about proning every patient, but yes, proning for few hours every day will improve the lung ventilation. So that's one of the strategies that we can use to ensure a better oxygen saturation. We can start with high flow nasal cannula, upgrade to a non-invasive ventilation using a tight fitting face mask. If you cannot tolerate it or still the saturation is falling, then you will have to intubate. And well, the prognosis with the intubated patient is relatively bad because in our settings, ventilator associated pneumonia would come in. I've just shown this snapshot to highlight the fact that if you read the Government of India guidelines in the investigational therapies, he has talked about convalescent plasma therapy as well as remdesivir and tocilizumab. So yes, he is saying that informed decision making should be done. If a person is going into cytokine storm, interleukin 6 values are 100 times on normal, 1000 times on normal, yes, tocilizumab will also be used. But we cannot say that these drugs are reducing mortality because the sample size as of now is not adequate to demonstrate that. So in future, obviously, a lot of new things will come up, but as of now, the way the question is framed, the main mortality reduction is with steroids. After steroids, it is low molecular weight heparin, and both of them are to be discontinued on discharge in a person. He's saying there's no rule of continuing once the worst is over. The answer to this question is option number A. Coming to the next one, an easy one. He said, what is the most critical manifestation of CKD? You see, the kidney is responsible for excretion of potassium. Hyperkalemia, as you're all aware, can contribute to development of possible diastolic arrest in a person. Usually, values of potassium in excess of 8 can be life-threatening, and you might even have to do hemodialysis in this guy, or medical therapy in the form of insulin drip and calcium gluconate would be required. The answer to this MCQ will be option number A. The remaining options can be easily ruled out because if it's going to be a low GFR gradually, I can plan a kidney transplantation for this guy. He's saying the word critical, which means that immediately now I need to take action. Like if today evening I'm giving this discussion, I get a call that, okay, I have a known patient or a family member who's having CKD and is having a potassium of 8. I need to take a decision, that is immediate admission, give calcium gluconate, give insulin drip, and if required, even you plan a hemodialysis for the patient. The answer to this question will be option number A. The leading cause of COVID-19 pneumonia would be diffuse alveolar damage. You see, endothelial injury will obviously play a role in pathogenesis of ARDS. So if the question was mainly as ARDS, which cell is mainly involved, it is endothelial cell. But the initial impact is obviously a diffuse alveolar damage, and then the subsequent sequence of events will occur in the person. The answer to this question is option number A. Coming to the next question, he's talking about a case of dengue who was admitted and is not having any fever for last 24 hours and is having a good appetite. Now I want to tell you the fact that when fever in dengue comes down, that is when usually complications occur, and the complications are two. One can be dengue shock syndrome and second can be dengue hemorrhagic fever. Let's read on. His BP is 110 by 70. Hemodynamic stability is there, so that is like ruling out dengue shock syndrome. Hematocrit is 44%. That is a decent value for an Indian patient. You see, in dengue shock syndrome, the main lesion that is present is capillaritis. So there is gonna be leakage of fluid out of the capillaries, and that causes hemoconcentration. So in DSS, you will be having hematocrit of 60% or even higher. In fact, if hematocrit rises by 20% over the admission value, it means person is going into dengue shock syndrome. But in this particular case, I am ruling out the possibility of DSS occurring in this patient in the defervescence period. When the fever is going down, DSS is unlikely. Why? Because the BP is stable, hematocrit is pretty normal in Indian range. TLC of 4K is anyway gonna be present in any viral infection, so that does not have any therapeutic decision making challenge. However, platelet count of 14K is a cause of concern, because if it dips further and goes less than 10,000, goes towards 5,000, the bleeding might be dramatic. The person had an episode of epistaxis on blowing nose that has resolved spontaneously. That tells you the fact that there is no active bleeding occurring in this guy at the moment. So I would definitely not in this circumstances start platelets, because platelets, even if I give, the antibodies will destroy them, and anyway transfused platelets have a lifespan of limited time frame of 24 hours. So even if I cause a transient rise of platelet count right now by giving 4 units of platelets to this tab, by tomorrow evening the platelet count might again come down. So it's a wastage of resources. A guy having a definitive possible active bleeding would be rather the one who would be having more requirement of platelets. The question is saying what is the next best step in management of this patient. I'm ruling out option number A because he's not in DSS. For dengue hemorrhagic fever, I want to highlight that in this case, there is no active bleeding occurring in the patient. Yeah, the platelet count anytime less than 10K. If this MCQ was having a platelet K of 4K, I would have given platelet rich plasma to this person. But since the value is given to be higher than the threshold of 10,000, I have explained to you that if platelet count is less than 10,000, there can be spontaneous bleeding. If there is a concomitant fever, the risk is increased even more. But in this case, the value is given to be higher than the threshold, so I'm ruling out the value or possibility of requirement of platelet-rich plasma for this guy. I definitely want to keep him under observation and give lots of fluids to this chap. The correct answer to this patient would be option number C and D. I know the fact that a lot of people they message me saying, "Sir, why can't it be option number B also? The platelet count is less." I told you the threshold that I've highlighted even in the lecture also is a value of 10,000 or lesser, and with febrile illness, the risk is definitely increased. The good news for this particular case is he's having hemodynamic stability, so DSS was ruled out, and at the same time, I need to keep him under watch. If he develops active bleed, yes, I need to give platelets. Otherwise, as such, there is no advantage of giving platelets, because that would be a transient rise. By tomorrow or by day after, the platelet count, if has to fall, will again fall. We use our resources very judiciously in cases of dengue. I would request you to listen to the dengue lecture that's given towards the end in the app of internal medicine, especially in the infections component. I've highlighted the core issues which are very frequently asked in the exam. In fact, the first line of this MCQ was indication for discharge, and that was asked in the mid-year exam. In the May exam, they had asked regarding this indication for admission, and in this particular paper where they rephrased the exam as INICT, they started the MCQ by this very line, that the person is afebrile, but he wanted to see your knowledge whether are you aware that when the fever comes down in dengue, that is when complications occur. That is when complications occur, and that is when you need to be on your guard. So I have selected option number C and D for this particular case. The answer to this question will be option number 4. Coming with the next question, that is a piece of cake. The question talked about HAGMA, that is high anion gap metabolic acidosis. Please remember, HAGMA is seen with cult, where K would stand for ketoacidosis. So option A is correct. U would stand for uremia. There's no uremia though in the options. Lactic acidosis definitely is on. T stands for toxins. So toxin would be ethylene glycol. You're aware that in ethylene glycol, no, there's a calcium oxalate crystals that are formed. Those calcium oxalate crystals that are formed in ethylene glycol poisoning are subsequently capable of contributing to acute tubular necrosis, and thereby the uremia component can set in. Option number A, B, and C are the ones which are going to be associated with HAGMA, whereas option number D, renal tubular acidosis, is associated with normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. I've highlighted this multiple times and I'll just dedicate 1 minute into this. In almost every exam which is conducted in India or abroad, they love to ask about NAGMA and HAGMA, that is normal anion gap metabolic acidosis and high anion gap metabolic acidosis. The mnemonics that I mentioned for them are the ones which have been simplified from ones that are available on the internet, etc. So I would like you to get these facts right. That is Dr. Fuse versus cult. I'll just write down one before you so that this becomes a permanent memory for you. It's diarrhea, normal anemia. Why? Because positive negative charges are lost equal. Then is gonna be renal tubular acidosis of all the varieties 1, 2, and 4. F would stand for fistula and U's would stand for ureterosigmoidostomy. When you go through various apps or internet or books, you will find across lots and lots of reasons why you are having a dagma versus a hagma, but I just want you to remember the core ones which are very frequently asked, and that was precisely reflected in the current INICET exam. The correct answer to this question is option number A. Coming to the next question, he's talking about a child who has had two blood transfusion requirements at 9 months and 11 months of age. He's having a maxillary prominence and a frontal bossing. So you are having two things in the MCQ. That's gonna be blood transfusion requirement with possible chipmunk faces. The peripheral smear of this person is loaded with target cells. So you are narrowing down the diagnosis of this guy to thalassemia. The question says, what is the best way for diagnosis of this condition? Option A, bone marrow aspiration is anyway ruled out because here we're talking about a defect of globin, so we need to go in for HPLC or we can go for genetic studies. I'm ruling out two options. You have to select between B and C in this particular question. Option number B says parental HPLC. HPLC can be done in the patient, it can be done in the parents also. In fact, if a parent is carrying a trait, you see, if father, husband, or wife is carrying a trait, then the chances of development of disease is anyway 25%, no, because the pattern of inheritance is there. So if you demonstrate a trait in either of the parent, it means the chances of diagnosis is increased. The best answer to this question would be given as globin gene analysis because anyway, PCR or genetic analysis is superior to all other conditions. MCQ wise, if in this question it was multiple responses, then it is B and C. Otherwise, the best answer to this question would be option number C. Genetic studies are always superior to identify. No, you can also identify whether it is thalassemia major or thalassemia intermedia. Though in this particular case, looking at the transfusion requirement before the first year of life, this looks like a presentation of thalassemia major, but that is again clinical. No? Transfusion dependency is more in major, lesser in intermedia, but then you cannot differentiate saying major versus intermedia on basis of transfusion dependency alone. You need a genetic substantiation of that how is the you need to quantify the magnitude of beta chain production. Like let me say there's a 0% beta chain production and all the cells that are produced are having alpha 4 tetramers, then it's gonna be thal major. But if it's gonna be some beta and some alpha production in approximate amounts to at least cause some RBCs to be normal, it could be intermedia. And when you are talking about trait, then there are no manifestations. The answer to this question should be given as option number C. The next question talks about treatment of absence seizures. That's going to be a rare one that is found in children. We have discussed the common one that is encountered in children happens to be febrile seizures. For this, I think one of the easier ones, the answer would be option number A and B. Moving ahead. The question says what is correct about COPD. The point is in COPD there is air trapping. This air trapping will contribute to increase in the residual volume of the patient. Because the residual volume will increase, even the FRC will increase because functional residual capacity is a sum of expiratory reserve volume and the residual volume. So if residual volume will increase here, then the FRC can also be increased. The question says increased TLC. TLC is a sum of all the parameters. No, if you add all from top to bottom, that is inspiratory reserve volume plus tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume. If you add all together, it is total lung capacity. So if residual volume is increased, what are the three things that are increasing? It is residual volume, it is FRC, it is TLC. So I'm just putting a mark here to say option A is correct. B says increase vital capacity. You see, COPD people are having breathlessness. No, the inspiration part is affected because there are bulla, there are blebs. So definitely this is not a right statement. Then we always talk about FeV1 FVC ratio. Please remember in obstructive airway disease, this ratio will always be reduced. The ratio can either be normal or can be enhanced in restrictive airway disorders. The explanation for this has been discussed in a separate lecture where I've talked about flow volume curves, I've talked about spirometry. I've highlighted the fact that when it comes to restrictive lung disorders, that is where the numerator and the denominator both will be reduced. If both are reduced, ratio will either be normal or will be relatively increased in the person, but it is always reduced in obstructive. When you look at option number D, it says increase FRC. That is what I was pointing out initially. That is the point that was missed out by a couple of people. The correct answer to this question would be option number A, C, and D. Coming to the next question, he's talked about a road traffic accident patient developing a pneumothorax with the right-sided mediastinal shift and the BP is crashing. What is the immediate action? If you look at the X-ray of this guy, you will notice a very characteristic absent vascular markings in this case. The lung blood vessels are not visualized. At the same time, you can also notice the collapsed lung borders, and there is definitely a very clear-cut mediastinal shift occurring. So this chap is having a left-sided pneumothorax with a mediastinal shift to the contralateral side. What are you gonna do? You see, in every case of tension pneumothorax, you need to evacuate it using a wide bore needle. The wide bore needle can either be put in second intercostal space, that's according to Harrison 20th edition. He also mentions that if a guy is working out in a gym and is having big pectoral muscles, then the needle may not reach the desired space. So you can raise the arm of the patient and put the needle in the fifth intercostal space. That is what is given here, wide bore needle in the fifth space. But that alone is not gonna be sufficient for this guy, because the moment the needle will reach the desired space, you will hear a hissing sound from the backside of the needle, because there will be air escaping out. This air is at positive pressure here. The air will tend to escape out when you put in a wide bore needle. But now you need to evacuate both a hemo plus a pneumothorax, because you see, if there's going to be pneumothorax, there could be concomitant blood also. Anyway, for management of these patients, step 1 is put in a wide bore needle so that at least the pressure on the SVC and IVC is relieved. Please appreciate the fact, the reason why we put a wide bore needle in these patients is because the positive pressure in the chest will crush the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, because of which the venous return to the heart will reduce and therefore the BP will become unrecordable. So the reason for putting a wide bore needle is to relieve the obstructive shock component of the patient, because the moment you reduce the amount of air, all air cannot escape, but some that will escape will at least reduce the pressure of the SVC, IVC, reduce the obstructive shock of these guys, so the BP will pick up. That will give you few precious minutes. What are you gonna do in those 5 precious minutes is then put in a chest tube. So the correct answer for this MCQ is gonna be wide bore needle followed by a chest tube, that is an intercostal drainage tube. And a lot of people messed up between thoracotomy versus stomy versus thoracocentesis, where thoracocentesis is done for diagnostic or for therapeutic reasons for pleural effusion. But we put in a chest tube, that would be called as thoracostomy, and this would be the best answer to this question. I personally feel this was a very easy one. I made a separate lecture on tension pneumothorax where I have even put images and rather snapshots from various movies where, war movies where they have shown tension pneumothorax in a soldier, and one of the such videos is posted on my YouTube channel as well. So when you have time, just go through that. It's just 2 minutes, 3 minutes maximum, crisp information regarding management of tension pneumothorax. If you go through that, I'm very sure you would be definitely able to get this question right in the first go. Coming to the next question, he talks about a 2-year-old child who has been diagnosed with nephrotic syndrome, and he's asking you what is correct about the vaccination strategy for this kid. Option A states give pneumococcal vaccine before starting steroids. You are aware of the fact that pneumococcus happens to be the leading cause of community-acquired pneumonia in children, and this child will very soon become immunocompromised because I'm going to give him steroids for relatively about 2 months at least in nephrotic syndrome. And if God forbid he becomes steroid dependent, then we will have to give steroids for a longer duration. So I don't want to wait and let him be immunocompromised and suffer from a pneumococcal sepsis or a pneumococcal pneumonia. I would be more comfortable giving pneumococcal vaccine right now. So this is a correct statement. Option B says only killed vaccines can be given when on steroids. We are aware from microbiology, PSM, medicine, pediatrics that live vaccines are not to be given in immunocompromised patients, but yes, killed vaccines can be given. The main bone of contention, the most controversial statement was with respect to option number C, OPV is not given to siblings. Well, honestly speaking, I was not aware of this, that this is a correct statement. I'll now give an explanation for this. To solve this controversy, what I did was I referred to the IAP, the Indian Academy of Pediatrics Vaccination Handbook. Let me just show you a snapshot from it and then I'll give an explanation. I have just zoomed in. You will notice the fact that he has categorically mentioned this statement: OPV should not be given to a child who is a member of a family in which there is immunocompromised persons, to avoid the possibilities of vaccine spread. It looks very surprising, no? Vaccine spread? Well, all of you are aware now that vaccine-derived poliomyelitis can also occur. So let me give an example to substantiate this statement. Let me explain why option number C is correct. Let me say there are two children in the family. One is the child who's suffering from nephrotic syndrome, and second is his elder brother. The elder brother is okay, no problems in him. Let us say the Asha worker went to the house of this particular family, and she gave OPV to the healthy child. She has not given it to the child of nephrotic syndrome because he's sick. So the parents said, "Oh, child is not okay. We don't want to give vaccine." The Asha worker said, "Okay, the healthy child, let me give the vaccine." Now, when this Asha worker will give this vaccine to the healthy child, there is a distinct possibility, though God forbid, I wish it never happens, but there is a distinct possibility that there could be a conversion of this live attenuated virus into the pathogenic virus, and we can have development of vaccine derived poliomyelitis. So the bad news is elder brother has developed vaccine derived poliomyelitis. This means that this elder brother will now be excreting that pathogenic virus in his stool. And in this house, because there is a definitive evidence of fecal-oral transmission, because poor family, right, fecal-oral transmission can be present. So the stool of this so-called healthy baby, remember he was earlier healthy, he was given OPV by the Asha worker, he developed a vaccine-derived poliomyelitis. Now the stool of this child is containing the pathogenic virus. If this stool gets mixed with the drinking water of the immunocompromised child, the immunocompromised child will definitely develop poliomyelitis. I'll try to explain that in हिंदी also. You see, मान लो दो बच्चे हैं, एक को नेफ्रोटिक है और दूसरे वाला हेल्दी है. आपने हेल्दी वाले को ओपीवी दे दिया आशा वर्कर ने, आपको तो पता भी नहीं है, क्योंकि जो नेफ्रोटिक वाला चाइल्ड था सिक था, तो पेरेंट्स ने मना कर दिया था कि हम नहीं लगवाएंगे वैक्सीन, तो हेल्दी वाले को पिला दिया. उस हेल्दी वाले को वैक्सीन डायरेक्ट पोलियोमाइलिटिस हो गया. अगर हो भी गया तो उसके स्टूल में पैथोजेनिक वायरस एक्सक्रीट होगा ना, और वो फीकोरल ट्रांसमिशन से ड्रिंकिंग वाटर के थ्रू वो अगर इम्यूनो कॉम्प्रोमाइज चाइल्ड की बॉडी में आ गया तो उसका तो इम्यूनिटी पहले से ही लेस है ना, तो उसको तो पोलियोमाइलिटिस और भी ज़्यादा सिवियर हो जाएगा. तो ये बहुत ही सरप्राइजिंग स्टेटमेंट है. ओपीवी इज नॉट गिवन टू सिबलिंग्स ऑफ द चाइल्ड. दिस इज अ करेक्ट स्टेटमेंट अकॉर्डिंग टू IAP, इंडियन अकेडमी ऑफ पीडियाट्रिक्स, हैंडबुक ऑफ वैक्सीनेशन. डी सेज वैक्सीनेशन एज पर शेड्यूल, तो वो तो वैसे भी करते ही हैं हमने रूटीन इलनेसेस में. तो द करेक्ट आंसर फॉर दिस वुड बी ऑल स्टेटमेंट्स आर करेक्ट, राइट. एंड ऑप्शन नंबर सी का जो कंट्रोवर्सी है, आई होप आई हैव रिजॉल्व दैट. आई हैव शोन यू अ स्नैपशॉट फ्रॉम द टेक्स्ट बुक आल्सो, एंड वेल इट मेक्स सेंस. दैट्स अ वेरी सेंसिबल स्टेटमेंट दैट द चाइल्ड हुज इम्यूनो कॉम्प्रोमाइज, उसको फीकोरल ट्रांसमिशन से तो वैक्सीन डायरेक्ट पोलियोमाइलिटिस आई सकती. कमिंग टू द नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन, ही इज सेइंग ऑल ऑफ द फॉलोइंग आर ट्रू बट सबएक्यूट कंबाइंड डीमाइलिनेशन एक्सेप्ट. Option A is copper deficiency causes similar symptoms. You are aware of the fact that copper is an integral component of the electron transport chain, and that will be present in the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. In case there's a copper deficiency, the electron transport chain is not functioning properly, so even the RBCs and the central nervous system and even the peripheral nervous system will be affected. If the RBCs are going to be affected, they can be anemia component, because the peripheral nervous system, especially with respect to myelin formation, is affected, so there could be neurological features as well. So copper deficiency can cause a combination of anemia and peripheral nervous system, and sometimes even CNS manifestations that can mimic the features of SACD, because in SACD also you have a combination of macrocytic anemia with neurological features, though both may not coexist. One of the important reasons why do you have copper deficiency as of now, right? One of the important reasons for copper deficiency is excessive amount of zinc intake on a regular basis. We are nowadays giving lots of zinc supplementation to even COVID-19 patients also, because nowadays the fad is zinc is an immunomodulator, so load the patient with zinc. If you're gonna load the patient with zinc, after a couple of months you will notice that if he continues taking zinc on long-term basis, that there could be copper deficiency, because zinc inhibits the absorption of copper from the gut, and therefore he could have features that can mimic those of SSCD. B says dorsal column and lateral tracts are involved. You see, both of them are heavily myelinated tracts. So the end result would be that there would be proprioception loss, there can be lateral spinothalamic pathway, and even the corticospinal pathway is involved, no? That can contribute to even neurological motor manifestations in a person. That is why you can read about brisk DTRs and even Babinski sign, because it involves the corticospinal pathway. In fact, the radiological finding, you see, if you look at the spinal cord here, what I've shown here is, and you can definitely pick up, this is the dorsal column that is responsible for proprioception, that is joint and position sense, whereas lateral to this is the lateral spinothalamic pathway, which is responsible for pain and temperature, and this is the corticospinal pathway, the one in the yellow. So all of these are highly myelinated tracts. And the end result of vitamin B12 deficiency is that all of these will malfunction. So it can also result in a neurological finding, which is referred as an inverted V sign, because the way these tracts are arranged, the dorsal column, the lateral spinothalamic, the corticospinal pathways, it can contribute to a MRI finding of an inverted V sign. So the manifestations of a myelopathy which can be having these would be B12 deficiency, copper deficiency, HIV, Taves totalis, and diabetes. Anyway, fits in neurological manifestations always. So B is a correct statement. C says B12 supplementation improves the condition. True. I mean, normally spinal cord diseases are having no cure. But one spinal cord disease where you are definitely positive about the outcome is vitamin B12 supplementation, which will give IV initially, then intramuscularly once a week, then once a month, and so on. So ABC definitely look like a correct statement. But as I highlighted right in the starting, that there might not be coexistent neurological features in macrocytosis. It's not a guarantee, right? It could be just neurological manifestations occurring at the moment. The mean cell volume initially might be normal. The correct answer for this MCQ is option number delta. The reason being that neurological impairment per se can be present without the macrocytic component. Moving to the next question. He says iritis is gonna be seen in. You can solve this question. The trick he played was simply the word uveitis. Instead of that, he wrote the word iritis. So uveitis can be seen with psoriatic arthritis, with Behçet's, though anyway you are familiar with because we study the word oro-oculogenital syndrome. So in the ocular manifestation, there is definitely a uveitis, and that contributes to even a pus in the anterior chamber, that is hypopaeon, and you are very much familiar about it. When it comes to SLE versus rheumatoid arthritis, I just want to highlight the fact that rheumatoid arthritis, if you listen to the lecture, I have highlighted regarding manifestations of dry eye. The most common ocular manifestation of rheumatoid arthritis is not uveitis. With all the rheumatological disorders, you will see uveitis written. But when it comes to rheumatoid arthritis, there are two very predominant features. One is keratoconjunctivitis sicca. Then he will start talking about scleritis or episcleritis or even scleromalacia. Scleromalacia per se is relatively rare, but if he just says what is the, in fact, if you go through the rheumat section in rheumatoid arthritis, I've categorically said that uveitis is never a feature with rheumatoid arthritis. It is keratoconjunctivitis sicca, scleritis, and episcleritis. The correct answer for this question would be that the top three options are right. So A, B, C are the correct statements for this particular case, and it's rheumatoid arthritis which is the odd one out. And instead of writing uveitis, because he spoke about iritis, so that could have ruffled a bit of feathers, and maybe the question options, maybe people might have answered two or maybe even one option for this. The correct answer is, however, the top three are having iritis, but not the last one. The next one talks about cortical and subcortical dementia. Well, you are familiar with the fact that cortical dementia will mainly be two, Alzheimer's disease and Pick's disease, as you can highlight. And one of the highlights of cortical dementia will be mainly it's the memory symptoms that are more common, and the motor symptoms are rare. Whereas when it comes to subcortical dementia, like Huntington's chorea, no, it's chorea that is a predominant manifestation. So motor symptoms are more common in subcortical dementia. When it comes to Parkinson disease, that is also an example of subcortical dementia. So when we talk about Huntington's, Parkinsonism, progressive supranuclear Gaze palsy, HIV, AIDS, they're all examples of subcortical one where motor symptoms will predominate, along with obviously a bit of the memory issues as well. Comprehension part can be affected, calculation issues can be affected, coordination issues can definitely be affected in subcortical dementia. You just need to get this table right. If you just get the orientation of the table, you are bang on spot for this question. Pick's disease, where we read about Guy cells are being relatively razor sharp, in contrast to Alzheimer's disease, where you can be having is flattening of the Guy cell size. That's the answer to our question. You can see the fact that option A, B, C are examples of subcortical. However, Pick's is the correct answer to this question. The option answer D is the right one. Coming to the next question, it says which of the following is a smoking related interstitial lung disease? Well, we traditionally read about smoking causes COPD, but smoking can cause interstitial lung disease also. Which are the ones which are related to cigarette smoking? I have highlighted this in the lecture of interstitial lung disease in the app. You will notice the fact that I have spoken regarding desquamative interstitial pneumonitis, then is RBLD, which is respiratory bronchiolitis, which was option A, and PLCH, that is pulmonary Langhans cell histiocytosis. I repeat the statement once again. This is present in the app section of interstitial lung disease. Three lung diseases which are associated with cigarette smoking are the ones which are highlighted here. It is desquamative, that RBLD, and pulmonary Langhans cell histiocytosis. And he is just asking you to select the right options. This question has been repeated quite often in the JIPMER exam actually, and they picked it up from there. The correct options here are option number A, then would be C, and then would be D. So option 2 would be the right one for this particular question. Moving next. This talks about a 40-year-old smoker with chronic cough, breathless and pruritic chest pain for last 2 years. Now that's fairly a long time. And when you read about cough and chest pain and dyspnea, you're thinking in terms of COPD because he's talking about a cigarette smoker. The HRCT of the patient is shown below. Let's look at the options here. A says bronchiectasis. Now, bronchiectasis will be having multiple dilated airways present, but in this case, you are not noticing any grossly dilated airways. In fact, you can notice a bit of consolidation present on the right side. And at the same time, you can definitely notice what looks like a small cavity or a air-filled area with respect to the right lung posteriorly situated. I'm ruling out bronchiectasis in this case because I'm not able to see the classical tram track appearance. I'm not able to see the classical signet ring appearance, and bronchiectasis will have bilateral manifestations, whereas in this particular image, the manifestations are present mainly unilateral. So I am giving option a big no. Cystic fibrosis is an important cause of bronchiectasis. I'll put it like this: option A and option D. I mean, cystic fibrosis causes bronchiectasis in the long run. So if bronchiectasis can't be the answer, cystic fibrosis obviously can't be. When it comes to COPD, you see, usually you will be having either emphysema, chronic bronchitis. In emphysema, you should be able to see presence of blebs. You should be able to see bullas, but in this case, there is no visible bulla. Rather, what looks like here is a round cavity which is having some kind of membranes. So the benefit of doubt on basis of the clinical history as well as the radiological finding is hydrated cyst. Because the hydrated cyst is situated peripherally, that is why pruritic chest pain can also be explained. You see, any lesion close to the pleura will irritate the pleura, and therefore chest pain can be a manifestation. The chest pain will worsen on deep inspiration. The correct answer to this particular question is option number C. The primary reason is unilateral lesion present, long duration of symptoms present. You are anyway aware of the fact that in hydrated cyst, the most common site involved is the liver, and the second most common site of the body involved is the lungs. So there's a distinct possibility that the cyst can burst also. No? Then the person will say salty fluid coming in the mouth lots of time, and that salty fluid coming in the mouth is because these cysts could communicate with the airway subsequently. The answer to this question is option number C. The next one talks about this male with gradually progressive stiffening of the spine. I personally feel that the answer is written right here. Progressive stiffening of the spine is what we read as bamboo spine in ankylosing spondylitis. The MRI spine of this patient showed a very significant amount of kyphosis, as you can see in this particular image. You see in ankylosing spondylitis, I've highlighted that a male patient will be having loss of height. Ankylosing spondylitis will cause the patient's body to be bent forward. A very significant kyphosis is present. Let's rule out other options. Psoriatic arthritis will mainly be having a DIP involvement, so that is ruled out, plus no psoriasis features are given. For fluorosis to be present, well, there should also be some mention about dental enamel changes. Without dental enamel changes given in a question, it is very unlikely that you can comment on diagnosis of fluorosis. And when it comes to rheumatoid arthritis, that would be anyway small joint involvement in the form of PIP, MCP, and the wrist joint bilaterally. And in this case, well, rheumatoid is more common in women, so even the gender goes against it. Considering the clinical profile, the best answer for this question works out to be ankylosing spondylitis. Moving ahead. The question talks about what is correct about the lesion shown. Well, it's a neuropathic ulcer in the sole of the foot. You are very well aware of the fact that when it comes to diabetes mellitus, I have told this guy never to walk bare feet. Neuropathy happens to be the most common complication of diabetes mellitus. I told this diabetic person, like in India, no, people have a habit of going in the park, and you would have seen they take off their slippers and they walk barefoot on the grass, because all those Ayurveda people say that walking barefoot on the grass improves brain circulation. Crazy chaps, brain circulation is not improved by doing activities like this. So, well, this guy did not pay heed to my advice, and he stepped over a irregular surface, or he stepped over an object which caused injury. He will neglect that injury. Why? Because it does not hurt. Diabetes patients can be having loss of sensation in the sole of the foot. This guy was walking bare feet. He had an injury on the sole of the foot and he neglected it. And well, the bad news is there was a development of a neuropathic ulcer. It could be present on the heel. It could be present on the metatarsal heads. Option A says distal pulse is absent. This is a feature that you read with thromboangiitis obliterans, where most of the time it is the dorsalis pedis artery that is obliterated. Please remember that in arterial ulcer, the location of the ulcer is dorsum of the foot, whereas in this particular question, the location of the ulcer is in the sole of the foot. So option number A is definitely ruled out. This is not Burgess disease presentation. B says neuropathic lesion. Yes, that's okay. Venous ulcer, again not. Venous ulcer would be present on medial malleolus. You left with angiopathy. You see why ulcers don't heal. Why do not ulcers heal in diabetes mellitus, though you do a correct amount of dressing on a regular basis? I mean, your internship posting might be for a long duration. The patient was admitted on the first day. He might be discharged after 2 months because the ulcer does not heal or takes a long time to heal. That's because of the concomitant angiopathy which is present in this. The blood vessels in diabetes mellitus, the smaller ones, tend to become narrow. So the local blood supply of the tissues is hampered, and this contributes to delayed wound repair. I want to highlight the fact that what I mean by angiopathy here is a delayed wound repair is very characteristic of diabetes mellitus, and therefore two correct options, option number B and D, will make point number 3 as the correct answer to this particular question. Moving to the next one. This 20-year-old girl came to the OPD. The following finding was noticed by the physician. One of the finding that is very characteristic is hyperpigmentation, which was very faint as per couple of students. And then, the nails were relatively white. I mean, in India, I would say that anemia component is so common that seeing white nails is relatively no big deal. But yes, hyperpigmentation would give you a possible clue to the diagnosis. I'll personally say that this was relatively a difficult one. You see, iron deficiency anemia per se will not be having hyperpigmentation, especially over the knuckles. And then iron deficiency anemia most of the time could be even having those spoon-shaped nails, the coily onychia that is present. So if he was wanting answer as iron deficiency anemia, I personally feel he could have given the coily onychia image, which is not given, so I'm ruling out A. B says megaloblastic anemia, vitamin B12 deficiency. You see, B12 is what we usually study about anemia, neurological, but not hyperpigmentation. So this could be the answer. Let's move on. Aplastic anemia. You see, aplastic anemia will always have pancytopenia, so there must be history given of recurrent infections. I mean, a girl coming to the OPD with only hyperpigmentation and maybe anemia is very unlikely. There could be manifestations of bleeds, there could be petechiae, purpura, recurrent infections, and anemia present or pancytopenia not present. When it comes to thalassemia, you see thalassemia will present in pediatric age group as major or intermediate, or the minor one will never present. So I'm ruling out option number C due to paucity of pancytopenia features. I'm ruling out thalassemia primarily because the age group of the patient at this time is relatively less likely, though it could be thalassemia minor. You see, if in the question it was written minor, I could have considered that option. So between B and D, the correct answer to this particular question is option number beta, that is megaloblastic anemia. Now, why is that so? Well, this is what the textbooks say. They say that vitamin B12 is responsible for maintaining a reduced glutathione. Glutathione can be, oxidized subsequently, but it is the reduced form of glutathione that is beneficial for the body. And this glutathione has a check mechanism on melanin production. In case there is a vitamin B12 deficiency, there is going to be a loss of check on the melanin production. So therefore there would be increased production of melanin. That explains the hyperpigmentation in vitamin B12 deficiency. I'm very sure a lot of people have discussed this MCQ earlier and they told you that hyperpigmentation is a clinical feature of B12 deficiency. I'm trying to tell you why. Right, the basic reason behind that, why do you read about more melanin? The reason is lack of check mechanism on melanin production from the melanosomes, and B12 is gonna, B12 levels are regulatory, basically that's the concept. And if the regulatory levels are not there, the check mechanism is gone, so melanosomes will produce more melanin. That explains hyperpigmentation as a clinical presentation of macrocytic anemia, that is both anemia as well as hyperpigmentation will be noticed. And if these patients are not treated or they're not diagnosed, then later on even neurological features can develop in these cases. Moving to the next one, that is match the following. You see, asbestosis, you are familiar. Asbestosis base is the one that is involved. Asbestos is relatively heavy, so it causes a lower lobe infiltration. So I'll just connect it to part number 3. Then is silicosis. So I'm just thinking what could be the association with silicosis, because normally you read about silicosis causing massive hilar lymphadenopathy, or the most common occupational lung disease could be associated with tuberculosis. But in this 4 options, it is rather the crazy pavement pattern. You see, when you read about crazy pavement, you see it with PAP, pulmonary alveolar proteinosis. That's where the surfactant is not cleared. Then is pneumocystis jirovecii pneumonia. Then is sarcoidosis and silicosis. Both are having a crazy pavement. Then are 2 varieties of interstitial lung disease, that is non-specific interstitial pneumonitis and cryptogenic organizing pneumonia. And then is going to be ARDS as well. That's a little atypical one. Kaplan syndrome is associated with co-workers pneumoconiosis, so relatively easy. So I think if you can just connect the dots here, you are bang on spot for answering that mesothelioma can be associated with the pleural effusion, calcification of the pleural plaques, and yeah, the pleural effusion is not a big one, so there may not be a mediastinal shift present. Most guys were able to crack this one. Was, I would say, a relatively simpler one. The next question talks about a 40-year-old lady on drug treatment with migraine presenting with severe chest pain. She has history of CAD also. Which drug is responsible? You see, she's having chest pain. That means there is some vasoconstriction. So there must be some drug given for migraine management that is causing vasoconstriction. You are familiar about the fact that one of the drugs that is not recommended for migraine as of now, first line is ergotamine. When I was a student your age, I used to read ergotamine because ergotamine causes vasoconstriction. No? So if a person is having very severe headache and the person will pop in more pills of ergotamine, the vasoconstriction can be so severe that it can cause chest pain. It can even cause gangrene of the tips of the fingers. So we do not use ergotamine first line for management of migraine without patient, I would say, education. The second drug that we use regularly for management of migraine is, and especially the severe variety of migraine where the MIDAS score is relatively on the higher side, there we will be using triptans for the patient. Now triptans per se can also have a rare side effect that they can act on the 5-HT1B 1D. You see, traditionally 1B 1D is what we read with respect to extracranial blood vessels, right? But 1B 1D would be present in the peripheral blood vessels also, and this would cause a vasoconstriction. So, well, it would be a serotonin agonist, no? Because this triptan mechanism of action is what he's trying to see here. You know, the question could have been simply from pharmacology saying what is the mechanism of action of triptans. He just made it in a clinical format, and he just wanted to see that you're familiar. The triptans are not antagonists; they are 5-HT1B 1D agonists, and that can contribute to a vasoconstriction. It can contribute to even gangrene of the tip of the fingers. That's very, very rare, but yeah, I mean the chest pain component can be affected because these would be present not only in the brain circulation but in the coronary circulation also. You can easily rule out nitrates because nitrates are the treatment of choice for chest pain. Calcium channel blockers will again result in resolution by decreasing the oxygen consumption of the heart. I mean, C and D can be ruled out because they are anyway used in management of chest pain. You see, if a person is having chest pain due to increased heart rate, you could be using diltiazem or verapamil. Like in PSVT, we can be giving verapamil on long-term basis to prevent PSVT from occurring, and that can prevent the palpitations in the chest pain component that can occur with PSVT. You have to select between A and B. I think it's the agonist part that he wanted to listen to, and therefore the answer to this question is option number A. The next question talks about a young chap. He's a victim of road traffic accident with the GCS of 8, so he's pretty serious, going into coma. He was intubated. Comatose patients cannot secure their airway, right? So he was intubated. The CT head was done but was normal, but there was evidence of raised ICP present in the form of posturing, or it could be bradycardia, chain strokes breathing, hypertension developing in the patient. So he's talking about evidence of raised ICP present clinically, but as such, there's no CNS bleed, there's no cervical injury or fracture. What is the likely diagnosis? This is a repeat question. Option A says posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. This is what is seen with hypertensive crisis. But in the MCQ, he is not giving you hypertensive crisis. So I'm ruling this option out. Option A is not related to trauma. This is mainly features of occipital and parietal lobe manifestations seen with hypertensive crisis. When it comes to option B, post-concussion syndrome, this could be like a soldier in front of whom a grenade exploded. The loud noise of the grenade, luckily when the grenade explodes, the guy can be, broken into pieces. The guy can die. His body will disintegrate. But luckily he ducked and the grenade exploded, but the loud noise and the shock wave that comes with a bomb blast or a grenade blast can contribute to concussion. So lot of the gunners who work in the artillery division of the army, like the soldiers who have worked in Kargil, they were having these shells coming over from Pakistan side and the shells could be exploding near them. So lot of these patients or chaps, the military chaps or the gunners most of the time, the artillery division chaps are gonna develop post-concussion syndrome. For diagnosis of post-concussion syndrome, symptoms should be present for 3 months. Obviously, occupational history in the form of an army chap in the artillery division or maybe in the anti-terrorist ops in Kashmir, that could be history given. And the history in this soldier will be headache, dizziness, irritability, impaired memory, and decreased tolerance to noise and light and ringing in the ears. lots of time, continuous ringing in the ears. That could be present for substantially long duration. So post concussion syndrome is always a diagnosis of exclusion in a soldier who has escaped a grenade blast or artillery. He's a gunner in the artillery division, and he is having these complaints for a substantially long duration. In our case, we are talking about a chap who just had a road traffic accident. This is a standard question, guys, that is given in the Q bank also, that every time a patient is coming to you with a road traffic accident, but the CT is normal, but evidence of raised SCP is present, the diagnosis is diffuse axonal injury. Why option is not D? Because if it was stroke, then there would be some findings of CT scan. No, at least the CT scan of the patient can be revealing at least some evidence of either a bleed or an infarction occurring in the person. The correct answer to this question is option number C. The learning point from this particular question is, whenever you get a question on RTA, the person is unconscious, evidence of raised ICP is present, but CT is normal. Then later on, MRI might pick up some damage at the junction of the gray matter and the white matter, but at the moment, the basic concept is CT normal in a chap post accident, evidence of raised ICP. You should think in terms of DAI, a diffuse axonal injury, must have been discussed even by the surgeon as well. Coming to the next question, he's talking about matching the following with respect to delivery of adrenaline. In cardiac arrest, where there's a flatline ECG, I'm going to stimulate the SA node by delivering adrenaline. The concentration will be 1 is to 10,000. It would be IV. If I cannot secure an IV route after 2 failed IV attempts, I'm going to use intraosseous access. In anaphylactic shock, I'm going to break the ampule and going to give undiluted adrenaline. I do not have time in these circumstances for dilution, and anyway, due to the histamine which is released in anaphylactic shock, the veins might actually collapse, so the veins may be dilated, so you may not be able to get a IV access. Anaphylactic shock causes laryngeal edema. To prevent that from happening, you need to give undiluted adrenaline. You just need to break the ampule, load half of the adrenaline in the syringe, that is 0.5 ml, and inject it into the body of the person. Even if you can't take off the clothes, doesn't matter, just inject it into any visible muscle and you would be able to save a person. And lot of doctors are very apprehensive over the fact that if I'm going to give undiluted adrenaline, will it cause ventricular fibrillation? No, undiluted adrenaline has not been documented to cause a ventricular fibrillation. You can use it very comfortably. Please appreciate the fact that anaphylactic shock, if it occurs before your eyes and if you fail to give adrenaline or adrenaline is expiry date in the emergency tray, it's a medical legal negligence. So anyway, emergency tray should always be available even when you're doing routine vaccination. You see, failure to have a emergency tray when you are doing something as simple as vaccination is again gross medical negligence. So you learn obviously these facts as you will get into practice, but at the moment is the time of MCQs. But I just wanted to tell you the fact that in anaphylactic shock you need to be really aggressive. The next question talks about this lady who's having abdominal pain and gross distension of the abdomen. The vitals are stable, but there is presence of dullness in the flanks. He's asked us to select the correct options. The option A says minimal amount of fluid should be 1500 ml to show shifting dullness in flanks. Now that is not correct, because we are aware that for shifting dullness to be evaluated in a person, you'll turn the person to one side. No, the note will change. You see, if initially it was dull because there was fluid in the flanks, if you turn the patient to one side, it will become tympanitic or resonant, because obviously there is gonna be air present in the bowel. So for shifting dullness, the fluid should be at least 500 ml. Ultrasound can pick up fluid as little as 100 ml. True. I mean, by puddle sign, we are able to evaluate a fluid which is in excess of 100 ml. In fact, when I've discussed the ascites topic, this is the first statement that I've said, that if it's gonna be puddle sign, it should be more than 100 ml. Ultrasound can pick up relatively earlier also. And one of the leading causes of ascites in a person, why would you be having this gross abdominal distension, is due to cirrhosis that will contribute to portal hypertension in a patient. So option number B, D, and E are correct for this one. Moving ahead. This was based on calculation. The question said a 35-year-old person has been admitted with gross ascites. Now some people also mentioned the duration here. Some people did not mention the duration. So if you are aware of the duration part here, do ping me. Do let me know if the duration was given, because that would definitely help us in decision making. The abdominal paracentesis of this person was done maybe because he was having breathing difficulty. The fluid is clear, devoid of cells on microscopy. The ascitic albumin value is 1.2 and serum albumin is 3.5. I mean, you know the serum albumin is between 2.5 to 3.5. So all you need to do here is calculate the SAG. SAG would mean serum albumin ascites gradient. If you just do the mathematics here, you will subtract 1.2 from 3.5 and you will have a value of 2.3. This means the fact that since this is value more than 1.1, it is responsible for transudative etiology. You see, in ascites, we do not use the word transudate versus exudate, but the principle is still the same, no? If it's gonna be a exudate will always have a higher concentration of protein. As a result of it, the SAG values will decrease. But when it comes to a transudative etiology, then we have SAG values of more than 1.1. So let's just work out the options. It was this table that is asking you. You see, you have to first rule out a couple of options here because this is a transudate. So TB can be ruled out because tuberculosis is exudative. Nephrotic syndrome. A problem in nephrotic is serum albumin will also be less, no? In nephrotic syndrome, serum albumin is also less, as well as the ascitic fluid albumin is also less because it is lost in the urine. That is why the value is turning out to be less than 1.1. So if you focus on this table on the right hand side, then nephrotic syndrome and tuberculosis are scenarios. I'm not saying that nephrotic is an example of an exudate. That's the dichotomy data, na? That you do not use the word transudative exudative primarily because of the fact that nephrotic is transudative actually, but it is still falling into this mathematical gradient of less than 1.1 because serum albumin is also less and the ascitic albumin value is also less. So nephrotic and TB both are two options which are to be excluded in this case. That's what I've done. Now we need to resolve between Budd-Chiari versus cirrhosis, so the diagnosis can be made subsequently on step 2 in this question. Step 2 would be you have to look at the ascitic protein. You see, ascitic protein, if it is less than 2.5, it goes in favor of cirrhosis, whereas when it's gonna be greater than 2.5, it is early Budd-Chiari. On this, I get a lot of queries from my students. I mean, most students ping me about this. Sir, why in early Budd-Chiari this is greater than 2.5 and why in this it is less than 2.5? Well, I can provide an explanation for that also. The explanation is that in late Budd-Chiari, there is a substantial sinusoidal damage. Damage to the sinusoids will prevent the transudation or movement of the proteins across into the ascitic fluid. In early Budd-Chiari, because the sinusoid is intact, the word is sinusoid is intact, so it can definitely allow the proteins to move across. So the ascitic protein values can definitely be, I can just write the word, it will allow protein migration into the ascitic fluid, so therefore the concentration can be even more than 2.5. But the later part, because the damage is irreversible, therefore there's no movement of protein, therefore the ascitic protein values become less than 2.5. If I come back to the original question, this was based on two steps, that is your ability to work out the table. First, you had to calculate SAG. Once you calculate the SAG, then you need to evaluate, okay, fine, this is more than 1.1. Okay. Transudative is just for reference, guys. I mean, I'll eradicate the word transudate from the discussion now because that will create a bias in your mind. Ascites is classified as SAG more than 1.1 or less than 1.1. The bottom line is that when it comes to cirrhosis, in cirrhosis, the production of proteins is automatically gonna be lesser because proteins are produced in the liver, no? So the liver will malfunction, therefore ascitic protein will be lesser. I repeat again, cirrhosis contributes to low ascitic protein. Why? Because after all, the synthesis is gonna be occurring in the liver. If the liver is malfunctioning, the value would be lesser. The correct answer for this multiple choice question would be option number D. Was relatively, I would rate it as a difficult one based on the fact that you had to go for two steps here. First, work out the SAG values. Second, check out the ascitic protein more than or less than. And as you can see, the value given here in this MCQ is 1.2. So you will focus on the left hand side of the discussion. That would be cirrhosis. Moving to the next question, couple of chaps who messaged me, they told me, sir, duration was 6 months. So we could not work out the calculation. So we thought that this is tuberculosis. Now, it's a possibility that if the question had different values of ascitic albumin, if I change the ascitic albumin values in this question, if I change the SAG values in this question, then definitely the answer can become any of these, but this is the values that I got. So in case you are having values different from what I have highlighted, serum albumin of 3.5, ascitic albumin value 1.2, if you're having values different from these, do ping me and let me know. But this is what I got to know from most of the guys who got good ranks, and I talked to a lot of guys who are in the top 100 ranks. I had a Zoom call with them and they provided me with the options for this one. So I think that it's fairly reliable, and I think all guys are at the same level, guys. It's not, we have this discrimination in the mind, rank 1, rank 50, rank 100. I mean, all of them are at the same level, or rank 1000. You see, that day, how your brain is clicking and reacting to the situation is what ultimately matters. A lot of us, we have this bias in our mind. This guy is rank 1, this guy is rank 100, rank 1 will be knowing more. No, it is not like that. All these guys have slogged the same. It is just at that time, in that 3 hour period, how your brain is reacting to that stimulus of questions being thrown at you. That's your mental strength all about. And that's what I keep on harping about, that if you want to highlight or develop your mental strength, sit on a laptop, give these mock tests very, very seriously, and don't be a lazy bum, as I say. So don't lie down and give a test just by lying casually in a bed, on giving it on your mobile phone. It should be given on laptop. You should be sitting comfortably for 3.5 hours. And believe me, guys, it looks very easy, but prolonged sitting, it's usually, I find most guys chicken out by 1.5 hour. Most guys are like, doing like this because back is hurting. Even in my discussion, if it's going long, you might be putting me on 2x and listening to me at the moment, because you see, this activity is gonna be having more neuronal requirement, neuronal recruitment. You see, if you're watching some entertainment video, that's a high dopamine. It gives pleasure, but it requires very less neuronal, मतलब दिमाग कम लगता है ना, तो हर आदमी ये चाहता है भी कम दिमाग वाली एक्टिविटी करनी पड़े. But the activity that you are doing at the moment, that is a low dopamine, less reward will come after long time, right? It's instantaneous reward is not there. So our brain, we are slaves of internet nowadays, because internet causes release of dopamine. Remember my words there, guys. Internet causes release of dopamine at minimal activity. You see a video of a puppy playing around, and it causes dopamine release because you find, oh, that puppy is so cute. So your brain gets addicted to activities which will cause more release of dopamine with less effort. That is why we watch these videos. Even YouTube algorithm, no, it is like this. All videos that would be having more dopamine release in the brain, they will be shown in your feed, and all these ones which are technical ones will be lower down in the feed. That's because that's how YouTube wants to increase their viewership. Coming back to the discussion, the question says the following is useful for. In fact, when this image came, a lot of guys were a little far, but then you could have worked out, because anyway, this is not CPAP. Because when it comes to a CPAP, you would definitely be able to see a bigger machine with waveforms being seen, inspiration and expiratory waveforms which are present. So in this case, there are no waveforms present. So there was an option C, which was a dummy choice, ventilator without a monitor. So I'll rule that out, dummy choice. You left between FibroScan. Couple of people answered that. We use FibroScan for evaluation of cirrhosis, right? But then it should show some at least some probe, no? Because FibroScan is just like an ultrasound. You put a probe on the tummy of the person, and then the waves are reflected from a cirrhotic liver. The fibrosed liver will reflect those waves, and you are able to calculate the shear stress. So FibroScan is basically a non-invasive test to evaluate the shear stress in a fibrotic liver. Well, this is a machine which is a image on the internet from a Chinese company. So the AIMS people actually took up an image of a, you can see, Zanzung or Zanzing, some company name is there given in this image on, if you Google it at the moment. And that Chinese company is manufacturing, Chinese are manufacturing high-end medical devices. So this is gonna be a device, the blue tubing you can see here. This is gonna be a blender, and this will be used to deliver high flow nasal oxygen to a person, which would be useful for management of patients of COVID-19 pneumonia who are not able to manage their SpO2s. SpO2 less than 90, you will admit the person and put him on what I have shown here, that is deliver with help of high flow nasal cannula. This is the machine, and this is the first step that we usually follow. Subsequently, if the person is not improving, you would have seen we shift him to non-invasive ventilation, where we could be using like BiPAP in the person. If the person is not improving with even a non-invasive ventilation, then we might be intubating the person and put him on elective ventilation. That would be assisted controlled mechanical ventilation, and we will also do proning. You see, in COVID-19 pneumonia, this is what we're doing now. We are first putting the person on high flow nasal cannula. If he's not improving, SpO2 is still low. Then non-invasive ventilation, still not improving, assisted controlled mechanical ventilation, the regular proning. And if this is also not working, then we are gonna be doing a procedure which was done in case of Dr. Sanket, no? Dr. Sanket, who was shifted to Chennai. Then it's gonna be ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. In extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, the oxygen will be delivered directly to the heart. No, the lungs have to be given rest. So this machine basically ensures that the lungs are given rest. And the ECMO machine, in fact, we now are having ambulatory, I mean, look at the technology that Americans and Europeans are using. They are using ambulatory ECMO machines, right? So you can see the patient recovering gradually, and then obviously once the person comes off ECMO, as Dr. Sanket did, he's back on duty. I mean, that's the kind of dedication that I'm talking about doctors, that you are sick yourself with COVID, you see somebody dying, you decide to intubate the guy. When you intubate that guy, it's a aerosol generating procedure, and you get such a big load of virus into your lungs that you land up in these situations. He was put on all these steps, and well, unfortunately had to undergo a ECMO procedure, right? So I mean, I would say that doctors are a class apart, a breed apart. No, I mean, if you are crazy enough to listen to my blabbering for this long, the person has to be crazy, right? I mean, as I said, YouTube does not promote low dopamine release videos. They promote high dopamine release. High dopamine means with little bit of something, little bit of a baby laughing, baby crawling, puppies playing around. Those kind of things are what are promoted by YouTube. Okay, coming back. We're talking about this 35-year-old guy who's having headache for last 2 months, and he is having one episode of seizure one day back. The patient is stable. Anti-epileptic drugs were started since the doctor had seen a MRI head showing cystic lesions with scolex and perilesional edema with multiple calcified lesions in the parietal lobe. Well, all the history is in favor of neurocysticercosis, and he's asking you regarding the management. For the management of this guy, this is what I've taught in the app. I want you to understand that wherever the lesion is present, wherever, like suppose you are able to see the scolex, wherever there is a lesion present, there will always be some evidence of perilesional edema. The reason why you have seizures, I want to highlight this concept. Why are you having seizures in neurocysticercosis? That not because of calcification, because calcification is a late feature. It is perilesional edema that will irritate the neurons and is responsible for development of seizures. I wanna reduce this perilesional edema by first giving dexamethasone. Then once the edema component is lesser, then we use albendazole for these patients. So please remember, we first give steroids and then give albendazole. I've highlighted this concept in the main section in the app, and this was reflected in the exam also. The options were like give steroids before antiparasite, give antiparasite before steroids. The correct one is first give steroids and then give antiparasite agents. And lots of guys who messaged me after the exam, the answer was like, sir, we did not even read the other options as I'm doing here, because there are some things which are gonna be like so in your face. Some questions can be so in your face in the exam that you read it and you know the answer. For those, obviously casually glancing through the options is obviously to be done, but then there are some which you are very confident about, like this one. Moving ahead, all of the following lead to secondary hyperparathyroidism, except you see in renal failure there would be less synthesis of vitamin D3. Less vitamin D3 would mean less calcium, and if you are having less calcium, then there would be a secondary increase of PTH. Vitamin D deficiency is going to contribute the same thing, no? Less calcium, so PTH will rise. Parathyroid adenoma is a primary cause. You see, secondary would imply there are a lot of physiological changes occurring, but parathyroid adenoma is a primary cause. GI malabsorption, the logic is still the same. If the gut is damaged, the absorption of vitamin D, fat soluble vitamin, will be lesser, again because steatorrhea can be responsible for vitamin D deficiency. So if the calcium values in a person is less, the PTH values will again rise. I think this was again one of the easier ones here. Parathyroid adenoma is a cause of primary hyperparathyroidism. The next question talks about a 25-year-old female who's having cyanosis of the digits when the hand is put in cold water followed by redness. So when you look at the description, he's talking about Raynaud's phenomenon, and he's asking you the causes of Raynaud's phenomenon. He's saying which of the following can be responsible. So triptans, well, triptans, sumatriptan, I mean pharmacology wise I wanted to remember bromocriptan used in Parkinsonism management and also for management of prolactinoma, and sumatriptan are drugs which can be associated with the Raynaud's phenomenon, and sumatriptan can even contribute to development of chest pain in a person. So A option is right. Migraine is a vasospastic disorder. You see, lot of women with migraine, they might be having concomitant Raynaud's phenomenon. In fact, if you have listened to my discussion, I've highlighted women with migraine, they in later age group can even have prinzmetal angina. In fact, I've highlighted 3 vasospastic disorders, no? Vasospastic disorders are Raynaud's phenomenon, migraine, and then obviously prinzmetal angina as well. Cryoglobulinemia was the one that people were missing out. Cold antibodies. Cryoglobulinemia is what you see as a complication of hepatitis C, can be associated with development of Raynaud's as well as ischemic stroke. I repeat that statement again. Essential cryoglobulinemia can one be associated with development of ischemic stroke and can be associated with even Raynaud's phenomenon. So option number C is also a correct one. That is what people were missing. D, well, hyperthyroidism, we do not read about any Raynaud's phenomenon per se. So it would be option A, B, and C is correct. Moving to the next one. A woman with morning stiffness which gradually resolves over 1 hour. So we are thinking in terms of rheumatoid arthritis. He says which of the following is correct about the treatment and the findings. Option A says NSAIDs improve symptoms and are having disease modifying activity. I have explained in the app categorically NSAIDs are not used anymore. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. You see, in earlier times when I was a student your age, rheumatoid arthritis primary treatment was NSAID followed by DMARDs. Now we don't give NSAIDs. We straight away start with DMARDs. We use triple therapy. For details of triple therapy, you need to refer to the main lecture. But the bottom line is option A is wrong because we do not use NSAIDs anyway for management of RA as of now. Because the more you delay the initiation of DMARD, fearing the side effect profile, no. Methotrexate is something when you tell a patient I'm going to give methotrexate, person will Google methotrexate, so many side effects. So person will give so many questions to a doctor that most guys would start with not methotrexate or other DMARDs. They would rather start with painkillers. But they say the more you delay, more is the deformities that occur. So option A is a wrong statement. NSAIDs have no definitive rule. That's a definitive statement in the 20th edition of Harrison. Absence of erosion on X-ray rules of diagnosis. Well, rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis is never made on basis of X-ray, one. And second, I mean, we have antibodies, no, anti-CCP that you can be using for diagnosis. Erosions will develop very late. And even if they develop, if a radiologist or a physician is not very adept at reading an X-ray of a hand of a person having post rheumatoid arthritis erosive lesions, if he's not seen an X-ray like that before, he'll miss the findings. Raised ESR and CRP. Yeah, if you read the scoring pattern for rheumatoid arthritis, we definitely use ESR and CRP for diagnosis. In fact, I've highlighted the only arthritis where ESR CRP can be normal also is rheumatoid arthritis. But if it's elevated, that adds on to the diagnostic score. HLA-DR4 is related to prognosis. Yes, obviously the HLA appearance of a person or the HRA subtype of a person also decides the prognosis of this particular condition. So option number C and D are the ones which are correct statements here. Therefore, option number 4 will be the right one for this question. Now, before I discuss the last question of this particular discussion, I just want to point out to regarding a Sigurd-Anderson normogram which is given in Genome. In this, on the x-axis, it is the pH of the blood, and on the y-axis, you have bicarbonate values and PCO2 so that you can plot and know the status of the patient. The point is that in metabolic acidosis, pH is less, PCO2 is less, and bicarbonate is also less. So I'm just putting a star mark here to say the fact that if you look at this area, pH would also be less, bicarbonate will also be less, and the values of PCO2 will also be less. That is metabolic acidosis. So I'm just writing MA here. On the other hand, in metabolic alkalosis, all the arrows go in the same direction. pH is high, PCO2 is also high, and bicarbonate is also high. So the extreme right upper quadrant here is where metabolic alkalosis would be present. You see, this Sigurd-Anderson normogram is for rather non-medicos or for, I would say, those people who are not very comfortable in interpreting the EBG, because nowadays you have apps available where you can feed in the data and know the report immediately. But in earlier times, this normogram was being used, especially by nurses, to interpret the status of the patient so that they can ask the doctor and the doctor can advise an intervention. The bottom line is, if you follow the EBG discussion that I've done in the app, in metabolic acidosis, you will notice the arrows of all three, pH, PCO2, bicarbonate, all is less. In metabolic alkalosis, all is gonna be elevated. So that's where the two ends have been highlighted. Now let's focus on what has been taught to you for respiratory acidosis. You see, the point is, in respiratory acidosis, there is gonna be less pH, but the PCO2 of the person is grossly elevated. PCO2 values are grossly elevated because you see more CO2 will cause carbonic acid and proton generation. So pH is less, so I am moving it towards the left side, and PCO2 is elevated. So this is the area where respiratory acidosis would be present. You can just see the fact that in metabolic acidosis, it is all three lesser. That is why it has been plotted. Whereas when it comes to respiratory acidosis, what happens is that if carbon dioxide will rise, protons are more, so bicarbonate will increase with the help of the kidney, no? The kidney is responsible for bicarbonate reabsorption. So if you see the table that I've drawn for respiratory acidosis, and I'll draw it once again before you, you will notice the fact that bicarbonate values are increasing. In fact, I can just highlight this here so that you can relate to me relatively better. Because if you are listening to this discussion without listening to the ABG lecture, it might be a bit of drag for you. So I'm just trying to simplify things for those who are new entrants for this. In metabolic acidosis, what happens is that all three in the ABG will be less. So you can just plot it on this normogram. When it comes to metabolic alkalosis, all three will be relatively elevated. So you can again plot it on the normogram. But when it comes to respiratory acidosis, I want you to focus very clearly here. Whenever there's going to be a respiratory acidosis developing, the pH and PCO2 arrows will go in opposite direction. And because if the protons are generated to neutralize the protons, you need bicarbonate now, so the kidney will kick in. It will reabsorb the bicarbonate from the proximal tubule. That is why I placed respiratory acidosis here. Now I will talk about respiratory alkalosis where pH is more. So I'm going to move on to the right side of this normogram on the x-axis because alkalosis is written. But arrows are always opposite in respiratory problem, no? So PCO2 will be on the lower side. And if protons are less, then bicarbonate will be kicked out by the kidney, because you see if there's an alkalotic state, the kidney wants to lose the bicarbonate. So this is the area where respiratory alkalosis will be present. Well, what they did in the exam was they just put on pointers like A, B, C, D and asked regarding metabolic acidosis, alkalosis, respiratory acidosis, and alkalosis. I know the fact that a lot of you will quiz me regarding the fact that, sir, in the actual normogram, even acute and chronic respiratory acidosis is given. Well, you can differentiate between those two arms also by drawing this diagram. You obviously can memorize, but the first step in memorizing the Sigurd-Andersen normogram is metabolic acidosis and respiratory acidosis will obviously be on the left side because pH is lesser. You just need to figure out which will be superior, which will be inferior. So the inferior one will be metabolic acidosis. Why? Because pH, PCO2 and bicarbonate all are reduced. You can see bicarbonate also low. You can see the PCO2 values also on the lower side. So that's why it is on the lower side. Metabolic alkalosis is in the right upper quadrant. Respiratory alkalosis on the lower particular quadrant in this particular case. And then is the acute and the chronic varieties that can be summarized subsequently. So the question was putting pointers in this case. What I've just tried to tell you is that if you can just take a snapshot of this, right, just take a snapshot of this particular diagram that I did and just try to put in the values by yourself. X-axis the pH, the y-axis is that I've drawn the bicarbonate and the PCO2 values, and if you just try to plot this, you would get a mental orientation. So even if the jumble around with these ABCDs in future, you will definitely be able to crack the question. These are the details that I want you to understand, guys. As I always say, I'm going to highlight this again because this pumped up a lot of guys. I want you to understand you have to keep hammering till the wall breaks. So this concludes our session for today. Thank you so much for your patience and hearing me out, and I'm very sure you are going to make 2021 the year of your career. You're going to make 2021 the year to remember. Thank you so much.